black teen rescues a neighbor, ends up in handcuffs. The community won't stay quiet. Jayden Carter stared out the window of their modest apartment, watching the world go by. At just 12 years old, he carried more responsibility on his small shoulders than most children his age. While his peers were busy playing and enjoying their carefree summer days, Jayden spent his time helping his mother, Mrs. Carter, with chores, running errands, and ensuring his younger siblings were cared for. The apartment was quiet, save for the soft hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional sound of traffic from the street below. Jayden's mother had just left for her second job, her brow furrowed with worry as she kissed him goodbye. "Be good, Jayden," she had said, her voice laced with exhaustion. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Jayden nodded, understanding the unspoken weight of her words. He knew his mother worked tirelessly to provide for their family, often taking on long hours at the diner and the local grocery store to make ends meet. Their neighborhood, while vibrant and full of life, was plagued by poverty, and Jayden had seen firsthand the challenges his mother faced. As he tidied up the small living room, Jayden couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility that far exceeded his years. He made sure the dishes were washed, the laundry was folded, and his younger siblings were fed and entertained. He was a routine he had grown accustomed to, a dance of chores and caretaking that had become second nature to him. Despite the hardships, Jayden found solace in the little moments of joy that dotted his days. He loved listening to the stories Mr. Williams, an elderly neighbor, would share with him at the local library. Mr. Williams had a way of weaving tales that transported Jayden to faraway lands, offering him a brief respite from the realities of his own life. As Jayden finished his chores and prepared to head to the library, he couldn't help but wonder what adventures Mr. Williams had in store for him today. The library was a sanctuary, a place where Jayden could escape the confines of his apartment and immerse himself in the world of books and imagination. With a determined stride, Jayden stepped out into the warm summer air, locking the door behind him. The streets were bustling with activity, children playing in the distance, neighbors chatting on their porches, and the occasional car rumbling by. Jayden navigated the familiar path, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of trouble. Jayden made his way down the familiar streets, his backpack slung over his shoulder as he headed to the local library. It was a routine he had grown accustomed to, a brief respite from the challenges of his daily life. The library offered a quiet sanctuary, a place where he could immerse himself in books and find solace. As Jayden pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the familiar scent of old books and the hush of the library enveloped him. He made his way to his usual spot, a cozy corner near the back, where he knew he would find his friend, Mr. Williams, seated in his favorite armchair, a stack of books by his side. "Hey, Mr. Williams," Jayden greeted the elderly man with a warm smile. "How are you doing today?" Mr. Williams looked up, his face lighting up at the sight of the young boy. "Jayden, my dear boy, I'm doing just fine, thanks to you." He gestured to the chair next to him, inviting Jayden to sit. Jayden settled into the chair, eager to hear the stories Mr. Williams had in store. The two had formed an unlikely bond, with Jayden finding comfort in the older man's gentle wisdom, and Mr. Williams cherishing the companionship of the thoughtful young boy. "So, what have you been reading lately?" Jayden asked, his eyes scanning the stack of books. Mr. Williams chuckled, his weathered hands caressing the worn covers. "Oh, a little bit of everything as usual, but I've been particularly drawn to these biographies of influential African Americans. Their stories of resilience and triumph are truly inspiring." Jayden nodded, his own experiences shaping his understanding of the challenges faced by his community. "I can imagine. It must be amazing to learn about the people who paved the way for us." The two fell into a comfortable conversation, with Mr. Williams sharing anecdotes and insights from the books he had been reading. Jayden listened intently, his mind absorbing the lessons and perspectives that the older man imparted. As the afternoon wore on, the library began to empty, and the two found themselves alone in their cozy corner. Jayden glanced out the window, noticing the shadows growing longer and the sun dipping lower in the sky. "I should probably get going," he said reluctantly. "My mom will be expecting me soon." Mr. Williams nodded, a wistful expression crossing his face. "Of course, my dear boy. I wouldn't want to keep you from your family." He paused, his eyes suddenly clouding with concern. "Actually, Jayden, would you mind helping me gather my things? I'm not feeling quite as steady on my feet as I'd like." Jayden immediately sprung into action, gathering the books and placing them neatly in Mr. Williams' tote bag. "Of course, let me help you." As Jayden slung the bag over his shoulder, Mr. Williams slowly rose from his chair, his movements labored. Jayden moved to his side, offering a steadying arm. "Easy there, Mr. Williams," Jayden said, his voice laced with worry. "Let's take it slow." Together, they made their way towards the library's exit, Jayden guiding the elderly man with a gentle touch. Just as they reached the door, Mr. Williams suddenly stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him. "Mr. Williams!" Jayden cried out, quickly moving to catch the older man before he hit the ground. Jayden lowered Mr. Williams to the sidewalk, his heart racing with concern. He quickly assessed the situation, noting the shallow breathing and the pallor of Mr. Williams' skin. "Someone please help," Jayden called out, his voice urgent. "I need help." Passers-by began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Jayden looked around frantically, searching for any sign of assistance. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of sirens approaching. As Jayden knelt by Mr. Williams' side, holding the older man's hand, a sense of determination washed over him. He would not leave Mr. Williams' side, no matter what happened next. The afternoon sun beat down on the bustling sidewalk as Jayden crouched beside Mr. Williams, his heart racing with concern. He had just witnessed the elderly man collapse, and without hesitation, Jayden had sprung into action, calling out for help and cradling Mr. Williams's head in his lap. "Don't worry, Mr. Williams. Help is on the way," Jayden said, his voice calm and reassuring despite the growing panic within him. He gently squeezed Mr. Williams' hand, offering a comforting presence as they waited for the ambulance. Moments later, the wail of sirens pierced the air, and Jayden breathed a sigh of relief. But as two police officers, Officer Miller and Officer Johnson, rushed towards them, his relief quickly turned to dread. "What's going on here?" Officer Miller demanded, his tone harsh and accusatory. Jayden looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Mr. Williams collapsed and I called for help. I'm just trying to make sure he's okay until the ambulance arrives." Officer Johnson's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. "Is that so? We got a call about a disturbance. Looks to me like you're the one causing trouble." Jayden's heart sank, and he felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. No, you've got it all wrong. I'm just trying to help Mr. Williams. He's my friend, and he needs medical attention." But the officers were already reaching for their handcuffs, their expressions hardened by suspicion. "Son, you're coming with us. We'll sort this out at the station." Jayden's eyes widened in panic. "Wait, please, you don't understand. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to help." His pleas fell on deaf ears as the officers roughly grabbed him, pulling him to his feet and leading him towards the patrol car. Jayden glanced back at Mr. Williams, his heart sinking as he watched the elderly man being loaded into the ambulance, alone and without Jayden by his side. As the officers shoved Jayden into the back seat, he could feel the eyes of bystanders upon him, their expressions a mix of shock and outrage. Jayden's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. The ride to the police station was tense and uncomfortable, with Officer Miller and Officer Johnson exchanging hushed whispers, their voices laced with suspicion. Jayden sat in the back seat, his hands trembling, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. When they arrived at the station, Jayden was led to a small, sterile room where the officers began to interrogate him. They asked pointed questions, their tone accusatory, as if they were convinced of his guilt. "What were you with that old man? What were you trying to do?" Officer Johnson demanded, his eyes narrowed in scrutiny. Jayden's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to explain, his voice quivering with frustration. "I told you I was just trying to help him. He's my friend, and he needed medical attention. I didn't do anything wrong." But the officers seemed unwilling to listen, their minds already made up. They continued to press him, their questions becoming more aggressive and their demeanor increasingly hostile. Jayden felt a growing sense of helplessness and fear. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. He thought of his mother, and his heart sank, knowing she would be worried and distraught. As the interrogation dragged on, Jayden's mind raced, searching for a way to convince the officers of his innocence. He knew he had to stay calm and focused, but the weight of the situation was overwhelming. Just then, the door to the room burst open, and Jayden's heart leaped with hope. His mother, Mrs. Carter, stood in the doorway, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why is my son in handcuffs?" The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions shifting slightly. "Ma'am, we received a report of a disturbance. Your son was involved and we're just trying to get to the bottom of it." Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed and she stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. "My son was trying to help a man in need. He's not a criminal and you have no right to treat him this way." The officers hesitated, their confidence wavering under Mrs. Carter's unwavering gaze. Jayden watched, his heart swelling with hope, as his mother continued to advocate for him, her words laced with a fierce maternal instinct. As the confrontation unfolded, Jayden couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and admiration for his mother. She was a force to be reckoned with, and in that moment, he knew that he was not alone in this fight. The shrill sound of the police siren pierced the air as Jayden watched, helpless from the backseat of the patrol car. He had been detained, his hands cuffed behind his back, despite his desperate pleas to explain the situation. Jayden's heart raced, his mind reeling with confusion and fear. As the car pulled up to the police station, Jayden's mother, Mrs. Carter, received a frantic call from a bystander who had witnessed the incident. Her face drained of color as she listened, her hands trembling. Jayden, her beloved son, had been wrongfully accused and taken into custody. Without a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Carter rushed to the police station, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. How could this happen? Jayden was a kind, responsible boy. He would never do anything to harm another person. She had to get to him, to make them understand the truth. Bursting through the station's doors, Mrs. Carter approached the front desk, her voice shaking with emotion. "Please, I need to see my son, Jayden Carter. He's been detained, and it's all a mistake." The officer on duty regarded her with an impassive expression, unmoved by the desperation in her voice. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't release him until we've completed our investigation. the officer replied, his tone dismissive. Mrs. Carter's eyes narrowed, her determination unwavering. This is a mistake. My son was only trying to help someone in need. You have to let him go. The officer sighed, his expression hardening. I understand you're upset, but we have to follow protocol. Your son will be held until we can sort this out. Tears of frustration welled in Mrs. Carter's eyes, but she refused to back down. This is wrong, and you know it. My son is not a criminal. He's a good boy who is trying to do the right thing. I won't leave until you let him go. Her raised voice drew the attention of other officers, who quickly surrounded her. Mrs. Carter stood her ground, her maternal instincts fueling her resolve. She would not be intimidated. She would fight for her son's freedom, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Jayden sat in stunned silence, his mind racing with a million questions. How had this happened? He had only wanted to help Mr. Williams, to ensure the elderly man received the care he needed. Now, he found himself trapped, his future uncertain. Jayden thought of his mother, the strong, determined woman who had sacrificed so much to provide for their family. He knew she would not rest until she had cleared his name. The thought of her fighting for him, of the community rallying to his defense, gave Jayden a glimmer of hope. As the hours passed, the news of Jayden's detention spread like wildfire through the community. Bystanders who had witnessed the incident began sharing their accounts on social media, their outrage palpable. Jayden's story quickly gained traction, with local activists and community leaders amplifying his plight. The hashtag Justice for Jayden began trending, and soon the local news stations were reporting on the case. Jayden's name was plastered across headlines, his face becoming a symbol of the systemic bias and injustice that plagued their community. Back at the police station, the growing public outcry put immense pressure on the officers. Officer Miller and Officer Johnson found themselves scrutinized, their actions and biases called into question. They began to confront the uncomfortable truth that their assumptions had led them to unjustly detain a young boy who had only wanted to help. As the night wore on, Mrs. Carter refused to leave the station, her determination unwavering. She paced the lobby, her eyes scanning the faces of the officers, searching for a glimmer of empathy or understanding. Finally, a familiar figure approached her. It was Mr. Williams, the elderly man Jayden had tried to assist. "Mrs. Carter," Mr. Williams said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I heard what happened. I need to speak with the officers. They need to know the truth about your son." Mrs. Carter's eyes widened with hope, and she grasped Mr. Williams' hand, her own shaking. "Thank you, Mr. Williams. Jayden will be so relieved to see you. Please, come with me." Together, they approached the officers, Mr. Williams's frail frame belying the strength of his conviction. "Officers, I must speak with you. Jayden Carter is a hero. He saved my life today. You have made a grave mistake in detaining him." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Mr. Williams' words settling heavily upon them. Slowly, the realization dawned that they had acted hastily, their biases clouding their judgment. As the community's cries for justice echoed through the station, they knew they could no longer ignore the truth. Chapter 4 had come to a pivotal moment, with the aftermath of Jayden's detention sparking a groundswell of support and the officers confronting their own prejudices. The stage was set for a reckoning, a chance for the community to come together and demand the change they so desperately needed. The news of Jayden's unjust detention spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, igniting a wave of outrage and solidarity. Within hours, the incident had become the talk of the community, with bystanders and witnesses taking to social media to share their accounts. Amidst the growing chorus of voices, Jayden's friend Darnell was one of the first to act. Clutching his phone, he frantically recorded the confrontation between Jayden and the police officers, capturing the moment when the officers roughly handcuffed the terrified boy. Darnell's hands trembled as he narrated the events, his voice laced with disbelief. "They just grabbed him, man. Jayden was just trying to help that old guy, and the cops came and treated him like a criminal. This ain't right." Darnell's video quickly gained traction on social media, sparking outrage among the community members who recognized Jayden and his reputation for kindness. Within minutes, the hashtag #JusticeForJayden began to trend as people shared the video and demanded accountability. Across the neighborhood, residents rallied together, organizing impromptu protests and vigils. Mothers gathered on street corners, their eyes filled with a mix of anger and determination. They shared stories of their own children's encounters with the police, each tale adding fuel to the growing fire of righteous indignation. "This happens all the time, but we ain't gonna stand for it no more," declared Mrs. Johnson, a local community activist. "Jayden's a good kid and he didn't deserve to be treated like that. We gotta make sure the world knows what's really going on in our neighborhood." As the day wore on, the momentum continued to build. News outlets caught wind of the story, and reporters descended upon the neighborhood, eager to capture the community's response. Jayden's mother, Mrs. Carter, found herself at the center of the media frenzy, her face etched with a mix of pride and anguish. "My son is a kind, responsible young man," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He was just trying to help someone in need, and the police treated him like a criminal. This has to stop. We won't rest until Jayden's name is cleared and the officers responsible are held accountable." Across the city, the story of Jayden's plight resonated with people from all walks of life. Activists, community leaders, and even local politicians began to lend their voices to the cause, condemning the police's actions and demanding justice. Among the most ardent supporters was Mr. Henderson, the compassionate business owner who had previously offered Jayden and his mother a glimmer of hope. Moved by the young boy's selflessness and the community's unwavering response, Mr. Henderson knew he had to get involved. "What happened to Jayden is a tragedy, but it's also a wake-up call," he said, addressing a crowd of supporters gathered outside the police station. "We can't let this kind of injustice continue. We need to stand together, united in our demand for change. Jayden deserves justice, and we're going to fight for it, no matter what it takes." As the sun began to set, the streets were alive with the sound of chants and the glow of candlelight vigils. Jayden and his mother huddled together in the small apartment, their hearts heavy with the weight of the day's events. Yet, in the midst of the turmoil, they found solace in the knowledge that they were not alone, that their community had rallied to their side, determined to see justice prevail. For Jayden, the outpouring of support was both overwhelming and humbling. He had never imagined that his simple act of kindness would spark such a powerful response, but as he listened to the voices of his neighbors, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. In that moment, he knew that his story had the power to inspire change, and he vowed to use his newfound platform to make a difference in the lives of others. As the night wore on, the community's resolve only grew stronger. The hashtag #JusticeForJayden continued to trend, and the video of the incident spread like wildfire, reaching millions of people across the country. The battle for Jayden's justice had only just begun, but with the unwavering support of his community, he knew that the path forward was clear. The pressure mounted on the police department as the community's outrage over Jayden's unjust detention continued to grow. Officer Miller and Officer Johnson, the two officers involved in the incident, found themselves under intense scrutiny, both from their superiors and the public. In the days following Jayden's release, the video of the encounter had gone viral, sparking widespread condemnation of the officer's actions. Activists and community leaders demanded accountability, and the department could no longer ignore the growing calls for justice. Officer Miller, a veteran on the force, had always prided himself on his professionalism and dedication to his duties. However, as he replayed the incident in his mind, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. His partner, Officer Johnson, a younger and more impulsive officer, was also grappling with the weight of their actions. "I can't stop thinking about that kid, man," Officer Johnson said, his brow furrowed with concern. "We just jumped to conclusions without even listening to him." Officer Miller nodded solemnly. "I know. I thought we were doing our job, but now I'm not so sure. The way that boy's mother fought for him, it really hit me, you know?" The two officers had been summoned to the police chief's office, where they faced a stern reprimand. The chief made it clear that the department's reputation was on the line and that they needed to address the community's concerns. "This incident has caused a major rift between us and the people we're supposed to serve," the chief said, his voice laced with frustration. "We need to find a way to make this right, and we need to do it quickly." As they left the chief's office, Officer Miller and Officer Johnson found themselves in an unfamiliar position, questioning their own biases and the way they had handled the situation. The weight of their actions and the pain they had caused Jayden and his family weighed heavily on their conscience. Across town, Mr. Williams, the elderly man Jayden had tried to help, was recovering from his health scare. He had been following the news of Jayden's case with a heavy heart, and he knew he had to do something to set the record straight. Summoning his strength, Mr. Williams made his way to the police station, determined to speak on Jayden's behalf. When he arrived, he was greeted by a surprised Officer Miller and Officer Johnson, who had not expected to see him. "Mr. Williams, what are you doing here?" Officer Miller asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I'm here to tell you the truth about what happened that day," Mr. Williams said, his voice steady and unwavering. "Jayden is a hero. He saved my life, and you two treated him like a criminal." The officers listened in silence as Mr. Williams recounted the events, his words carrying the weight of sincerity and conviction. He described Jayden's quick thinking and compassionate actions, and how the officers had completely misunderstood the situation. As Mr. Williams spoke, Officer Miller and Officer Johnson felt a profound sense of shame wash over them. They had allowed their biases to cloud their judgment, and in doing so, they had inflicted unimaginable pain on a young boy who had done nothing wrong. "We made a terrible mistake," Officer Miller said, his voice heavy with remorse. "We let our own prejudices guide our actions, and we hurt an innocent child in the process." Officer Johnson nodded in agreement, his eyes downcast. "We need to make this right. We need to apologize to Jayden and his family, and we need to do it publicly." The officers knew that their actions had far-reaching consequences, not just for Jayden and his family, but for the entire community. They had to find a way to rebuild the trust they had so carelessly broken. As Mr. Williams left the police station, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew that his testimony had made a difference, and that the officers were finally beginning to understand the gravity of their mistake. For the first time in days, Jayden's future felt a little brighter. Back at the Carter household, Jayden and his mother, Mrs. Carter, anxiously awaited news of any developments in the case. The constant media attention and public scrutiny had taken a toll on them, but their resolve remained unwavering. Suddenly, the phone rang and Mrs. Carter's heart raced as she answered. It was the police department, requesting a meeting with Jayden and his mother. Gripping the phone tightly, Mrs. Carter listened intently, her expression shifting from one of trepidation to cautious optimism. As she hung up the phone, a glimmer of hope shone in her eyes. "Jayden, they want to meet with us. They said they have something important to discuss." Jayden felt a surge of anticipation, his mind racing with the possibilities. Could this be the turning point they had been waiting for? As they prepared to meet with the police, Jayden and his mother steeled themselves for what might come next, determined to stand their ground and fight for the justice they deserved. Tension hung thick in the air as Mrs. Carter stormed into the police station, her eyes burning with a fierce determination. Jayden trailed behind her, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. After hours of waiting, the moment had finally arrived for them to confront the officers who had wrongfully detained her son. "I want to speak to the officers who arrested my boy," Mrs. Carter demanded, her voice unwavering. The receptionist, taken aback by her assertive tone, quickly summoned Officer Miller and Officer Johnson. As the two officers approached, Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "You two have some explaining to do. Why did you treat my son like a criminal when all he was trying to do was help someone in need?" Officer Miller and Officer Johnson exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of their actions finally sinking in. "Ma'am, we made a mistake," Officer Miller admitted, his voice laced with remorse. "We should have listened to your son and assessed the situation more carefully." "A mistake?" Mrs. Carter scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "My son was terrified, sitting in a cell for hours because of your assumptions. You saw a young black boy and immediately assumed the worst, didn't you?" Officer Johnson shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor. We're sorry. We didn't mean to jump to conclusions, but the situation seemed concerning at the time." Jayden watched the exchange, his fingers trembling. He yearned for the officers to acknowledge their wrongdoing and offer a sincere apology, but the words felt hollow, like a bandage on a deep wound. Just then, the door to the station opened and a familiar face stepped in. "Excuse me, officers," a deep, resonant voice called out. "I believe I can shed some light on what happened." It was Mr. Henderson, the compassionate business owner Jayden had met at the library. He strode forward, his expression calm yet determined. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding here, and I'd like to help set the record straight." Officer Miller and Officer Johnson eyed Mr. Henderson warily, but the man's confident demeanor and commanding presence commanded their attention. "What do you know about this situation?" Officer Johnson asked, a hint of skepticism in his voice. "I've been following the events closely, and I can assure you that Jayden here is no criminal," Mr. Henderson stated, placing a reassuring hand on Jayden's shoulder. "In fact, he acted with remarkable courage and compassion in aiding an elderly man in need. The fault lies with your officers, who failed to see the truth of the situation." The officers shifted uncomfortably, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Mrs. Carter watched the exchange, her heart swelling with gratitude for Mr. Henderson's intervention. We understand now," Officer Miller said, his voice low. "We made a mistake in our judgment, and we'd like to apologize to you and your son." Jayden's eyes widened in surprise as the officers turned to face him, their expressions sincere. "Jayden, we're sorry for the way we treated you. You were trying to help, and we should have recognized that instead of assuming the worst. We were wrong, and we hope you can forgive us." Mrs. Carter felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she watched her son's face soften, the tension in his body slowly dissipating. I forgive you," Jayden said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, a warm smile on his face. "I'm glad we could resolve this misunderstanding. Now, if I may, I'd like to discuss something with you and your mother, Jayden. I believe I may have an opportunity that could help improve your family's situation." Mrs. Carter and Jayden exchanged a puzzled glance, their curiosity piqued. As they followed Mr. Henderson to a private room, a glimmer of hope began to shine through the darkness they had endured. The air in the police station was thick with tension as Jayden and his mother, Mrs. Carter, waited anxiously for the officers to arrive. After days of uncertainty and public outcry, the moment they had been fighting for had finally come. Jayden clutched his mother's hand, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Just a week ago, he had been wrongfully detained for simply trying to help an elderly man in need. But now, with the overwhelming support of the community, the tide was turning in their favor. As Officer Miller and Officer Johnson entered the room, their expressions were somber, a stark contrast to the arrogance they had displayed during the initial encounter. Jayden felt a surge of trepidation, unsure of what to expect, but Mrs. Carter squeezed his hand reassuringly, silently conveying her strength and determination. "Jayden, Mrs. Carter," Officer Miller began, his voice heavy with remorse. "We've come here today to offer our sincere apologies for the way we handled the situation the other day. We made assumptions based on our own biases, and that was wrong. We failed to see the truth and the humanity in what you were doing." Jayden's eyes widened in surprise, not expecting such a direct acknowledgement of their wrongdoing. Officer Johnson stepped forward, his gaze downcast. "We're deeply sorry for the pain and trauma we've caused you and your family," he said. "We understand that our actions have had a profound impact, and we want to make amends. Jayden, you were a hero that day, and we should have recognized that instead of jumping to conclusions." Mrs. Carter's grip on Jayden's hand tightened, and he could see the relief and pride in her eyes. After days of fighting for justice, their persistence had paid off. "Your apology is appreciated," Mrs. Carter replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "But it's not just about us. This incident has shaken our entire community, and it's a reflection of the systemic biases and prejudices that far too many of us face on a daily basis." Jayden watched as his mother spoke with conviction, her words carrying the weight of generations of struggle and resilience. He felt a surge of admiration for her strength and determination. "We demand accountability not just for this incident, but for the countless others like it that have gone unaddressed," Mrs. Carter continued. "The community deserves to feel safe and respected, and that starts with addressing the deep-rooted issues within your department." Officer Miller and Officer Johnson exchanged a glance, their expressions somber. They knew that Mrs. Carter's words rang true, and that this was a pivotal moment for them and the entire police force. "You're absolutely right," Officer Miller acknowledged. "We've been blind to our own biases, and that has to change. We're committed to working with the community, to listening and learning, and to implementing the necessary reforms to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again." Jayden watched as the tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of cautious hope. His mother's unwavering advocacy had made a difference, and he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride in her strength and resilience. Just then, the door opened, and Mr. Henderson, the compassionate business owner, stepped into the room. Jayden's eyes widened in surprise, and he felt a renewed sense of optimism at the sight of his ally. "Jayden, Mrs. Carter, I'm so glad to see you both here," Mr. Henderson said, his voice warm and sincere. "I've been following your story, and I'm honored to be a part of this moment of justice." He turned to the officers, his expression serious. "I'd like to offer Jayden and his mother a job opportunity at my company," he announced. "I believe in the power of community, and I want to be a part of helping this family start anew and build a better future." Jayden felt a lump in his throat, overwhelmed by the generosity and support that had surrounded him. Mrs. Carter's eyes shone with tears of joy, and she pulled Jayden into a tight embrace. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "This means the world to us." Jayden looked up at his mother, a newfound sense of hope and determination filling his heart. The journey had been difficult, but with the support of his community, he knew that anything was possible. As they left the police station, Jayden felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. The injustice had been acknowledged, and the path forward was clear. He knew that his story had the power to inspire change, and he was ready to use his voice to make a difference. With his mother's hand in his and the community's unwavering support, Jayden stepped out into the sunlight, ready to embrace a new beginning. Jayden stood in the middle of his new living room, a sense of wonder and disbelief etched on his face. The modest apartment with its bright walls and spacious layout felt like a world away from the cramped, run-down place he and his mother had called home for so long. As Mrs. Carter placed the last box down, she turned to her son, a radiant smile spreading across her face. "Can you believe it, Jayden? This is our new home." She wrapped him in a tight embrace, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. Jayden returned the hug, his own emotions swelling within him. "I can't believe it, Mom. This is amazing." He pulled back, surveying the room with a newfound sense of pride and hope. "It's so much brighter and bigger than our old place." Mrs. Carter nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Henderson really came through for us. I still can't believe he offered you that internship and helped us find this apartment." She shook her head in disbelief. "I never thought we'd be able to move out of that cramped little apartment." Jayden's face lit up as he recalled the events that had led them to this moment. "I'm so grateful for Mr. Henderson and everything he's done, and I'm proud of you, Mom, for fighting so hard to clear my name. I couldn't have done it without you." Mrs. Carter pulled him close again, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and relief. "And I couldn't have done it without you, Jayden. Your bravery and kindness inspired so many people. You're the real hero here." Jayden felt a surge of confidence and purpose. The tumultuous events of the past few weeks had been a whirlwind, but they had also shown him the power of community and the importance of standing up for what's right. As they began to unpack their belongings, Jayden couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had changed. From the weight of responsibility he had carried to the unjust treatment he had faced, he had emerged stronger and more determined than ever before. "You know, Mom," Jayden said, pausing in his unpacking, "I never thought that helping Mr. Williams would lead to all of this, but I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I was there to help him, even if the police didn't understand at first." Mrs. Carter nodded, placing a hand on his arm. "Me too, Jayden, and I'm so proud of you for having the courage to do the right thing even when it wasn't easy. You've shown that one act of kindness can make a real difference." Jayden smiled, his eyes shining with determination. "I want to keep making a difference, Mom. I want to help people, just like Mr. Henderson is helping us. I want to be a role model for others, to show that kindness and compassion can overcome prejudice and injustice." Mrs. Carter pulled him into another embrace, her heart swelling with pride. "I know you will, Jayden. You already have, and I have no doubt you'll continue to do so. This is just the beginning of your journey to make a positive impact on the world." As they continued to unpack and settle into their new home, Jayden felt a sense of excitement and purpose. The challenges he had faced had only strengthened his resolve to be a force for good in his community. With his mother's unwavering support and the opportunities presented by Mr. Henderson, Jayden knew that this was just the start of a new chapter, one filled with the promise of a brighter future.